Something unusual is happening in the world of technology right now, and most people still haven't noticed it yet. For decades, Linux was treated like the operating system for programmers, hackers, server admins, and people who enjoyed typing mysterious commands into black terminals. It was powerful, respected, and everywhere behind the scenes. But on the desktop, it always felt like the outsider looking through the window while Windows and Mac OS controlled the spotlight. But now, for the first time in a very long time, the entire tech industry is shifting in a direction that suddenly makes Linux look less like an alternative and more like the future. And that raises a massive question nobody can ignore anymore. Is Linux entering phase 2? Because if it is, this could become one of the biggest technology revolutions of the modern era. To understand why this moment matters so much, we first need to understand what phase 1 of Linux actually was. The first phase wasn't about ordinary users at all. It was about infrastructure, quiet domination. Linux slowly became the invisible backbone of the digital world. Almost every website you visit, every cloud service you use, every streaming platform you watch, and even most smartphones already rely heavily on Linux. Android itself is built on the Linux kernel. The servers powering companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, Netflix, and countless others run Linux in massive data centers across the globe. Supercomputers use Linux. Embedded systems use Linux. Smart TVs use Linux. Cars use Linux. Space agencies use Linux. Even the internet itself practically breathes through Linux infrastructure. But despite all of that success, Linux never truly conquered the personal computer market. It always remained the almost there operating system. Every few years, people would say, "This is the year of Linux desktop," and every few years that prediction would fade away. The reasons were always understandable. Software compatibility issues, gaming problems, hardware driver headaches, steep learning curves, confusing distributions, fragmentation, lack of commercial support. Linux enthusiasts loved freedom and customization, but average users wanted simplicity, convenience, and familiarity. Windows remained dominant because it worked for the majority of people, even if it wasn't perfect. Now fast forward to today, and suddenly the environment looks completely different. Microsoft is pushing AI deeply into Windows. Hardware requirements are becoming stricter. Privacy concerns are growing rapidly. Subscription models are expanding across the software industry. Ads inside operating systems are becoming more common. Online accounts are increasingly mandatory. User control is slowly shrinking while corporate ecosystems grow tighter every year. And in the middle of all this, Linux suddenly feels different. Not old-fashioned, not experimental, different in a way that now aligns perfectly with what modern users are starting to want. This is why many people believe Linux is entering its second phase. Phase 1 was invisible dominance. Phase 2 could become public adoption. And the signs are everywhere. Gaming was once considered Linux's biggest weakness, but that argument is collapsing faster than anyone expected. Valve changed everything with Proton and the Steam Deck. For years, gamers avoided Linux because too many games simply didn't work properly. But Proton introduced a compatibility layer so advanced that thousands of Windows games now run smoothly on Linux with almost no effort. The Steam Deck became one of the most important Linux products ever released because it quietly proved something huge to the world. Average users can use Linux without even realizing it. Many people bought a Steam Deck without caring what operating system it used, and the experience simply worked. That psychological barrier started breaking apart overnight. Now developers are paying attention. Game studios are testing Linux compatibility more seriously. Anti-cheat support is improving. Graphics drivers are improving. Performance in some games is surprisingly better than Windows. Suddenly, Linux gaming is no longer a joke or niche experiment. It's becoming legitimate. Then there's the developer revolution happening globally. More programmers are choosing Linux not because they're forced to, but because modern development increasingly favors Unix-like environments. Containers, Docker, Kubernetes, AI workloads, cloud-native applications, automation tools, and open-source ecosystems all naturally align with Linux workflows. Even Microsoft itself has embraced Linux in ways that would have sounded impossible 20 years ago. Windows subsystem for Linux exists because developers demanded Linux environments inside Windows. Microsoft contributes to Linux projects. Azure runs massive Linux infrastructure. The old Windows versus Linux war has evolved into something much stranger. Even the companies that once competed against Linux now depend on it heavily. But the real revolution may not come from developers or gamers alone. It may come from ordinary users becoming exhausted with modern computing trends. People are starting to notice how much control they've lost over their own devices. Updates happen when companies decide. Features appear that nobody asked for. Ads show up in operating systems people already paid for. Telemetry grows more aggressive. AI assistants become impossible to disable fully. Hardware restrictions force upgrades even when older machines still work perfectly. More software shifts toward subscriptions. More ecosystems become locked down. And with every passing year, the desire for ownership is returning. Linux represents something increasingly rare in modern technology: control. You can shape Linux into almost anything you want. Lightweight system for old hardware? Linux can do that. Gaming machine? Linux can do that. Privacy-focused environment? Linux can do that. Creative workstation? Developer powerhouse? Minimal distraction-free setup? Linux can do all of it. And importantly, Linux allows users to escape corporate dependency in ways that major commercial operating systems increasingly resist. That matters more than ever, because technology itself is entering a transition period. AI is changing how software works. Cloud computing changed where computing happens. Edge devices are becoming more important. ARM processors are expanding. Open-source AI models are exploding in popularity. Governments are paying closer attention to digital sovereignty. Educational institutions are reconsidering software costs. Countries are exploring alternatives to American tech monopolies. Suddenly, open-source systems are no longer just technical hobbies. They're becoming strategic assets. This is where Linux becomes extremely powerful. Unlike closed ecosystems, Linux evolves collectively. Thousands of developers across the world contribute to it. No single company fully owns it. That decentralized nature once made Linux feel messy compared to polished commercial products, but now it may become one of Linux's greatest strengths. In an era where people increasingly distrust centralized tech power, decentralized software feels more appealing than ever. And something else is happening quietly beneath the surface. Linux distributions are becoming dramatically easier to use. Years ago, installing Linux felt intimidating. You needed technical knowledge just to get basic hardware functioning correctly. Today, distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, Zorin OS, Pop! Us and others have transformed the experience. Interfaces are cleaner. Installation is easier. Driver support is better. App stores exist. Updates are smoother. Modern Linux desktops often feel surprisingly polished and beginner-friendly. Many users who try Linux today are shocked because it doesn't match the outdated stereotypes they expected. Of course, Linux still has weaknesses. Professional software compatibility remains an issue in some industries. Adobe products remain difficult. Certain specialized enterprise applications still rely heavily on Windows. Some hardware manufacturers continue offering weak Linux support. Fragmentation can still confuse newcomers. There are still moments when troubleshooting requires technical patience. Linux isn't magically perfect, but revolutions rarely begin because something is perfect. They begin because conditions change, and the conditions are absolutely changing. One of the most fascinating parts of this transition is how younger generations interact with technology differently from older generations. Many younger users no longer care deeply about traditional desktop software ecosystems. Their workflows revolve around browsers, cloud tools, cross-platform apps, Discord, web-based productivity, streaming services, and gaming platforms. If your daily life already happens mostly in a browser, the operating system underneath matters less than ever before. That weakens Windows' historical advantage. At the same time, Chrome OS unintentionally trained millions of people to accept Linux-based environments without realizing it. Chromebooks familiarized students with lightweight Linux foundations disguised behind simplified interfaces. Android normalized Linux-powered devices globally. The psychological resistance to Linux is weakening because people already use Linux-based technology constantly, even if they don't recognize it. AI could accelerate this even further. Ironically, the rise of AI assistants may reduce Linux's learning curve dramatically. One of Linux's biggest barriers was always complexity. But imagine asking an AI assistant inside your operating system how to fix issues, install software, optimize performance, or customize settings instantly. AI guidance could transform Linux from intimidating to accessible overnight. Terminal commands become less scary when intelligent systems help explain them naturally. Troubleshooting becomes easier. Learning becomes faster. And here's the twist most people don't realize. Open-source AI development heavily favors Linux environments already. Most AI research infrastructure runs on Linux. CUDA workflows, machine learning frameworks, cloud AI systems, and data science pipelines overwhelmingly prefer Linux ecosystems. As AI becomes central to computing, Linux gains even more strategic importance behind the scenes. Then there's hardware evolution. The dominance of ARM architecture is growing steadily. Apple proved ARM laptops can outperform traditional x86 systems in efficiency and battery life. Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, and other companies are all pushing new directions in hardware. Linux adapts quickly across architectures because flexibility is built into its DNA. Embedded systems, custom hardware, experimental devices, handheld gaming PCs, and AI appliances often rely on Linux because it's adaptable in ways proprietary systems struggle to match. This adaptability could become critical during the next decade of technological experimentation. And perhaps the biggest signal of all is this: major corporations no longer dismiss Linux. They're investing in it. Valve invested in Linux gaming because it needed independence from Microsoft. Red Hat built billion-dollar enterprise Linux businesses. Google relies heavily on Linux infrastructure. Amazon uses Linux massively. Microsoft itself actively supports Linux compatibility now. NVIDIA improved Linux support because AI demand forced it to. Even hardware vendors that once ignored Linux are starting to recognize its growing importance. That doesn't happen accidentally. Companies follow long-term trends before the public notices them. Still, many people watching this conversation ask an important question. If Linux is so powerful and promising, why hasn't it already taken over desktops completely? The answer is surprisingly simple: momentum. Technology ecosystems are incredibly hard to replace once they become dominant. Windows benefits from decades of software compatibility, enterprise integration, user familiarity, and pre-installed availability. Most people use whatever comes with their computer. Most schools teach Windows. Most offices rely on Windows workflows. Even when alternatives become viable, habits change slowly. But history shows that dominant platforms can weaken when technology paradigms shift. IBM once dominated computing. Nokia once dominated phones. BlackBerry once controlled business communication. Internet Explorer once seemed untouchable. Technological transitions create opportunities for new ecosystems to rise unexpectedly. And today we are clearly entering another transition period. AI, cloud computing, browser-centric workflows, gaming portability, open-source ecosystems, privacy awareness, and hardware evolution are all reshaping computing simultaneously. This creates cracks in old assumptions. Linux doesn't need to replace Windows overnight to become revolutionary. It only needs to become mainstream enough that users finally see it as a normal choice rather than an experimental one. That shift may already be happening. YouTube channels focused on Linux are growing rapidly. Linux tutorials are attracting millions of views. Gaming benchmarks comparing Linux and Windows now appear regularly. Privacy communities recommend Linux more often. Tech influencers increasingly discuss Linux seriously instead of treating it like a joke. Even ordinary users frustrated with Windows updates or privacy concerns are exploring Linux for the first time. And once people try modern Linux distributions, many are genuinely surprised. They expect ugly interfaces and confusing setups. Instead, they find elegant desktops, smooth performance, beautiful customization, low system resource usage, and a sense of speed that older hardware rarely achieves under Windows anymore. For many users, Linux feels refreshing because it prioritizes efficiency over constant monetization. That emotional reaction matters. Technology revolutions are not purely technical. They are psychological. People adopt new platforms when frustration with the old system becomes stronger than fear of the new one, and millions of users are becoming increasingly frustrated. The next phase of Linux may not look like previous operating system wars at all. It may not involve dramatic winner-takes-all battles. Instead, computing itself could become more decentralized. Users may rely on multiple operating systems across different devices. Web applications may reduce platform dependency. Linux could grow quietly across gaming, development, education, privacy-focused computing, handheld devices, AI systems, and emerging hardware without necessarily destroying Windows or macOS directly. In other words, Linux doesn't need total domination to become revolutionary. It simply needs relevance at consumer scale. And for the first time ever, that goal feels genuinely achievable. Imagine the future 5 years from now. Gaming handhelds running Linux become normal. AI workstations use Linux by default. Lightweight laptops ship with polished Linux distributions. Schools adopt open-source software to reduce costs. Governments promote digital independence using Linux-based systems. Developers prioritize Linux compatibility from day one. Browser-based workflows reduce dependency on proprietary desktop software. More creative tools support Linux officially. AI assistants simplify technical tasks for beginners. At that point, Linux stops being the alternative. It simply becomes part of mainstream computing culture. That would represent the true arrival of Phase 2. But there's another deeper reason why this matters so much beyond operating systems themselves. Linux represents a different philosophy of technology, a philosophy built around openness, transparency, customization, collaboration, and user control. In a world increasingly dominated by algorithms, subscriptions, data collection, closed ecosystems, and corporate lock-in, that philosophy suddenly feels incredibly relevant again. People are beginning to ask fundamental questions about ownership in the digital age. Who controls your device? Who controls your data? Who decides what software you can run? Who determines when your hardware becomes obsolete? Who profits from your workflow? Who watches your behavior? These questions are no longer niche concerns. They are becoming mainstream discussions. Linux offers one possible answer to those concerns. Not a perfect answer, not an easy answer, but an important one. And maybe that's why this moment feels different from previous Year of Linux predictions. Earlier, Linux enthusiasm was often driven mostly by enthusiasts hoping Linux would someday compete technically with Windows. Today, the momentum comes from something broader. The technology industry itself is changing in ways that naturally favor Linux principles. Open source collaboration powers modern development. Cloud infrastructure relies on Linux. AI research depends on Linux environments. Gaming compatibility improved dramatically. Privacy concerns are growing. Hardware experimentation favors flexible systems. Developers already live inside Linux ecosystems. Browser-based workflows reduce platform lock-in. All these trends are converging simultaneously. That convergence creates momentum. Will Linux completely replace Windows? Probably not anytime soon. Windows remains enormously powerful and deeply entrenched. macOS remains highly influential. Most users still prioritize convenience over control. Many industries depend on proprietary software ecosystems that won't disappear overnight. But revolutions don't always begin with total replacement. Sometimes they begin when an ignored technology suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. That may be exactly where Linux stands today. Phase 1 built the invisible infrastructure of the modern world. Phase 2 may finally bring Linux into the visible future of personal computing itself. And if that happens, the next decade of technology could look very different from the last one.